Today I'm going to be running back an old classic, and you know, I don't like to do too much repeating on the channel, but I've got some new ideas on this one and I think they're worth sharing. Batch painting can be a huge labour of love. For me personally, I often find myself in a position where I need to get a squad done, I want to speed up, I want to get things done more efficiently, but I don't want to see a huge quality drop from the single miniature display pieces that I'm used to painting. I understand that there have to be some sacrifices there, and sometimes what we get from a finished squad is never going to look quite as beautiful as something that we've really poured over on an individual basis. But even with these things considered, I think it's important to think about where we make those cuts and where we still invest a little bit more time. So I've got some fresh ideas on this subject, as I said in the intro, and I want to go over some of that today with you. We're going to be painting some Emperor's Children Chaos Space Marines, and a lot of the tips in this video will be a bit more specific to that. But then on the other side of that, there'll be also a lot of transferable stuff that you can maybe use to apply to other miniatures that you might be painting. So let's have a talk about that. Okay, I think the first thing to talk about is setting important expectations of yourself. We need to remember that this is not speed painting we're talking about here. This is just batch painting. This is just making things a bit more efficient so that you can chug through armies. There's still going to be some time investment involved. So if you're the kind of painter that maybe spends 8 to 10 hours on a single character, which is exactly the kind of painter that I am, then I'd be looking at maybe something like 20% of that. You want to be aiming for around sort of 2 hours per miniature. So you're still talking about 20 hours for a squad, which in my case, you know, is sort of 2.5 working days. Now that's still a 75% time save per model. That's a big difference. You know, 75, 80%. It's pretty extreme. So we need to think carefully where we're going to make those cuts. So with this commission, the Emperor's Children in particular, I wanted to do something that was just a little bit more elevated than standard tabletop. I didn't want to just, you know, base coat and shade these miniatures. I wanted them to have something to make them stand out. But at the same time, I didn't want to accidentally commit myself to 50 plus hours on a commission that I'd only charged about 20 odd hours for. So I needed to kind of come up with a bit of a plan for some things that I could do to trim the fat. Okay, first of all, when it comes to Space Marines, but also a lot of other miniatures, the power armor or the armor in general is usually one of the biggest things in terms of the largest space of single color, the sort of single most occupied thing on the miniature. But it also tends to be comprised of the simplest shapes. For the most part, armor is going to be the easiest thing to paint on a miniature. And so as such, it offers us an opportunity to make some big time saves there. Now I'm very lucky that personally I own an airbrush, and I will say this isn't the only approach. I will talk about that in a minute, so do not click off if you're not an airbrush owner. But for me, because I own an airbrush, this tends to be the easiest way to batch in the sort of main colour on things like Space Marines. So I'll just do sort of a 2-stage volume workup, you know, a fairly deep kind of lower mid-tone, something pretty bright that's actually a little bit too bright over the top of that. And then I'll just filter it off. In this case, I use some fluorescent pink from Vallejo just to filter this all off to kind of bring things together. And that'll get me through the entire batch pretty hastily with no real dramas. Obviously, that said, we don't all own an airbrush, and sometimes I'll receive commissions where the customer actually wants to replicate what I've done. They specifically ask me, you know, can you paint this in a way that is replicable by me? So if they don't own an airbrush, then in those situations, I'm going to be thinking about an alternative. Something like my 3-stage triad blending that I showed quite recently in a video, or my textural highlighting style, are really good things to bring in here because I can kind of still pull them through fairly quickly, fairly efficiently. I can still make the power armor a good time save, but at the same time those are things that basically anyone can replicate. So I would be looking for alternate techniques in those situations, but still trying to consider the power armor as one of the areas where I'm going to make up some time. So for a lot of things, I have a strong preference to working up from a black base. In particular, stuff like silver metallics, where the black base really benefits how shiny that silver is. Anything that's going to be painted another colour where I want to work up from a black shadow. Or in particular, again, stuff like soft joints on Space Marines or the piping, where they're actually going to be black. Now with something like an airbrush workup, you're normally going to have a lot of overspray going into those areas, which means that you're going to need to tidy them up anyway. But even if you've done all the armour by brush, you'll probably have a few bits of overspill here and there where you've been trying to save time. So this is typically going to involve a tour around the miniature, just painting stuff in black to get it all mapped out ready for further painting. If you collect Loyalist Space Marines, or even if you're using this video for some tips on non-Space Marine miniatures, congratulations, because this next step is going to be so much easier for you. Chaos Space Marines have a mountain of trim. It is no secret that it's one of the things that people like the least about painting them, me included. In fact, the trim can be such a nightmare that quite often it can be really tempting to just spray the whole miniature initially in the trim colour and then fill in the armour manually afterwards, because it makes the trim feel like less of an individual chore. Now the problem with this is that I think you're kind of just trading efficiency with the power armour itself, because if you spray the trim in first, what you're then going to have to do is be much more painstaking and careful with the armour so that you don't smudge onto the trim and then have to repair what is essentially a completed workup. You'll quite often see, for example, in Warhammer TV tutorials where they'll spray a miniature gold, then they'll Rakelan Flesh Shade or Agrax Earth Shade the whole thing, and then start painting armour panels in. This in particular you'll see with sort of Stormcasts and certain Space Marines. And I do feel that that is potentially a trap where you're just sort of trimming in one area only to weight it more towards the other. Now, because we can get such nice looking power armor so simply with use of the airbrush, for me it always makes more sense to paint the trim separately as its own process. But that's not always going to be true for you, so just consider which way round you want to place that efficiency. Okay, next in the process, I think it's really important to start thinking about your main accent colour. This is a time where you're going to be able to get that in and start to have an idea of what the rest of your workup looks like as a result. So in the case of my Chaos Space Marines, because I've got this sort of magenta hue, and then I've got the gold, which is, after it's shaded, is kind of a metallic sort of medium brown to tanny kind of colour. So I'm choosing a bright sort of tealy turquoisey colour here, in order to form sort of an approximation of a triad. By having this in earlier on in our workup, we now sort of start to understand the balance of these miniatures. We start to get an idea of which direction the sort of colour favours, and that makes it a lot easier for choosing the colours of things like our little accessories and the small bits that we kind of don't want to interfere with those things. It allows us to sort of be a little bit more on the fly because we kind of get all of the necessary information that we need earlier on in proceedings. However, that said, we should also at this stage be thinking about ease of access. Remember, it is okay to sequence break if it's going to save you hassle later on in the work. So for example, on a couple of these Chaos Space Marines, the chainmail area was actually sort of deeper into the sculpt than something that I needed to paint in my tealy turquoisey colour. So even though I was going around and doing the teals and turquoises and not the silver metallics at this point, on a couple of them I just did a sequence break, got the silver in quickly first, and then did the tealy metallics. And in order to do this, you just sort of pick up your batch, see which ones you're going to have to do that on, do a quick bit of silver on those specific areas first, and then just batch paint all of your teal. So it's not like it really holds you up, not dramatically anyway. Okay, and then at this point I'm gonna now start looking at the silver metallics in earnest, and sort of other smaller details as well. This is where I'm gonna start going around each miniature and filling in kind of all of those little bits of extra detail that, you know, don't really serve a major purpose to the look of the sculpts, but are still, you know, they're there, they're present, they need something on them. So silver metallics is going to be my main focus here, but I'm also looking at like leather pouches, belts, that kind of thing. In particular, something that I'm thinking about here as well is stuff that would be hard to reach once the miniature is assembled. And that is because in the next step, I actually want to get these miniatures assembled pretty soon before I finish them off. And that is to prepare me for the final push. So what I personally recommend here is come into your final push on the sort of last day that you intend to work on them. Like, make it a fresh day, make it a fresh morning, have a cup of coffee on hand, change to a fresh wet palette, be ready to get the squad finished, set out, to complete something that day. And so that's exactly how I handled these. I did sort of a couple of days on them of, you know, pretty casual pace, just kind of working through them. And then on the third day, I came into the office and actually set up to finish them. And so the point of what I'm actually going to be doing here, the actual kind of tip, I suppose, is that now at this final stage, I stop treating them like a batch. So what I'm actually going to do is fully assemble them, have them ready to go, start that day fresh with that attitude of I'm going to finish this squad here, and each one is now going to be treated as an individual miniature for all the last parts of its finishing off. And what that means is just that I take each one at a time and take it all the way through to completion. I've done all of the batch painting at this point. I'm now trying to complete these miniatures. And how far you decide to go on that is absolutely going to depend on a number of factors. If you're painting these for yourself, you may decide to individually take these as far as you can bear to take them. If you're painting them for a commission, and like in the example that I am, then, you know, that's going to be determined by sort of what you and the customer agreed you were going to do with them. But one of the real cool advantages of doing this, of sort of individualizing them for the final push, is that once they're fully assembled and you're starting to just kind of figure out what needs to be finished off on each one, you're not going to be doing things like, you know, running an edge highlight into an area that when you glue it together is pressed up to another panel and you can't see it. Like, you're not going to be wasting motion. And that's going to really, really help, again, with your efficiency. Sometimes when we go all the way through the process in sub-assembly and we batch paint every single thing, I've certainly found in the past that I've completely wasted my time highlighting areas, shading areas, detailing areas that end up being completely covered up by the miniature being fully assembled. And that isn't something you ever really want to do. You never want to be just putting time into nothingness, especially if you've got a whole army to get through, or if, like me, you're a commission painter with a backlog to get through. So now with all those processes done, let's take a little look at my squad so you can get a bit of an idea of where I got to with this batch painting. So, conclusions. In my opinion, and it is just my opinion, this is pretty subjective, I'm not going to lie, batch painting kind of should be a bit of a combination, a marriage of efficiency techniques and quality techniques. And that gives you a kind of sliding scale where you can adjust depending on the different requirements of either yourself or your customer. And that's a really important thing to do. But managing expectations and setting clear goals for yourself is definitely the absolute best way to get through a batch paint. Decide from the start what you're aiming for. Decide from the start what is an acceptable level of completion. Don't let yourself try to push beyond that and treat them like single display miniatures or treat them like character models or anything like that. Because what's going to happen ultimately is that whilst you may end up with 2 or 3 members of a squad that you're really, really proud of, by the time you get to number 4, you're going to be so burnt out, you're not going to want to look at that squad anymore. It's going to feel like a chore to continue painting it. And that's really not an ideal position to end up in when you've got a whole army to get through. And that's something that I've really learned the hard way over the years. So I hope that you found the tips that we've laid out in this video useful. Obviously it does serve as a little bit of a guide for painting Emperor's Children as well, although we've not focused so much on the paints and the techniques today, because I wanted to, like I said, run back this sort of idea of batch painting and discuss some of the new things that I've learned, as it's something that I've continued to develop for myself. So if you did enjoy the video, please do give it a thumbs up, and remember that you can subscribe to the channel and enable notifications if you want to stay up to date on what I'm doing. Also remember, if you really love the content and want to support its creation, I do have a Patreon. Tiers start from as little as $1 American a month, or whatever your local currency is. There'll be a link to that in the description, as well as all of my social medias if you want to follow me anywhere there to stay up to date on what I'm doing. So folks, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. I'm going to roll the end credits now, thank my existing patrons, and get myself out of here. So I will see you in the next one, folks. Bye-bye for now.